Okay, so today we're actually going to get into edit mode in Blender and start modeling proper. Up until now, we've just been really pushing around, moving, rotating, and scaling the basic objects. But now we can actually get into edit mode and manipulate individual components of those objects. So first, just as kind of a reminder, we're going to be dealing with polygonal modeling, which means modeling with polygons. This method of creating in 3D has three different components: vertices, or a single vertex, two vertices, or two vertexes, vertex. The line that connects them is an edge, and when you have three or more edges connected, you get a face. Okay? So vertex, edge, and face. In Blender, to get into edit mode, you hit tab. You can also go to this menu up here. You can see there's other modes besides object and edit mode. We're really just going to focus on object and edit mode for at least the next couple of weeks. But you hit tab, it'll jump back and forth between object and edit mode. And in edit mode, you can have a few different selection methods. Right next to that, you can see we've got three buttons. We have a button for vertex select, a button for edge select, and a button for face select. The shortcuts for those, one on the, not on the number pad, but on the top row numbers. One, we'll select, go to vertex select. Two, we'll go to edge select. And three, we'll go to face select. Okay? That's one for vertices, two for edges, and three for faces. You can select multiple by holding down shift and selecting multiple like you do in object mode. You've got all of your, on the left side, you have your various selection options. Those all work with components just like they do with objects. If you don't see this on the side, just hit T and it'll bring it back up. You can also click on this little arrow that's kind of tucked away on the side there. You can click and drag it across. Notice, and I'll go to vertex mode for this. It functions the same way as objects, where if you select multiple, the most recent vertex that you select is going to be white or a lighter color, and the others are going to be orange. So this is telling you that this vertex right here, is the actively selected vertex, and that matters for various operations that will come across. If you click and drag across all of these, and then orbit your camera view around, you'll notice that we missed one. By default, Blender does not select through objects. It's just going to select what's visible. If you would like to see through objects, up here on the top right, we have toggle X-ray. You see the shortcut there is Alt-Z. You click on that, and now suddenly we can see through the object, and if we click and drag across, we can select all of them. Okay? This is something that you'll probably end up going back and forth between. By default, I tend to like to keep it off, but every once in a while, if you want to select everything, it can be helpful to turn that on, and then you can click and drag across. So just make sure you're aware of what that setting is. And one habit that I've gotten into is, once I make a selection, I'll orbit my view around a little bit and just double check that I have selected what I want to have selected and I don't have anything else selected. Okay, because when you start doing things like extruding and beveling, having extra selections is going to just wreak havoc and get you into trouble. So I'd like to avoid that. It's probably relatively inevitable, especially starting out, that you will run into that problem. It's okay, but I just want you to be aware of that moving forward. So, but I'm going to turn that back off, so I don't want that right now. Another big point to keep in mind as we're going through this is, with polygonal modeling, generally we want to keep most, if not everything, in quads. By quads, I mean quadrilateral faces. So 4 sides. I was just, yeah. You can do 3-sided faces, you can do triangles, and you can do more than 4 sides, which would be, in 3D, they're called n-gons. And the N in n-gon stands for number. It just means a number of sides that is, in this case, greater than 4. Triangles are okay. N-gons are generally not, especially when you start deforming meshes and like bending objects and things like that. When you have more than 4 sides on a face, most 3D programs don't really know how to interpret that data, and you get weird artifacting and seams and creases that you want to avoid. So we will work towards keeping everything with 4-sided faces. And I know I mentioned this last week, but like I said, all of these individual components you can do the same transformation functions to them as you can with the objects as a whole. So you can move them, rotate them, scale them. Remember G to grab to move it around, R to rotate, and S to scale. And likewise, with objects, you can constrain those actions to 1 or 2 axes if you would like. So if we just want to scale along the x-axis, we can do that by hitting S to scale, and then X to constrain it to that axis. Same thing with rotate, R, and then let's say we just want to rotate it around the z-axis. We can do that, and scale, or G to move it, and maybe just on the y-axis. Okay. If you don't want to use key commands and you prefer the tools, we've got move, rotate, and scale here on the left side. And if you're ever if you click on those, the manipulators will show up, and you can move them that way, and that might be an easier way, especially starting out, to limit it to 1 axis. And remember, these squares in the center constrain it to 2 axes. So this is just going to be along the x and the y plane. You cannot move it up and down by moving it with that handle. If you prefer the key command, then what you're going to want to hit is G to move it, and then Shift Z, and that's going to exclude the z-axis. Okay, and you can do that with any direction. You can hit Shift Y to exclude the y-axis, and Shift X to exclude the x-axis. Again, you don't necessarily have to remember this right now, but at some point you're going to want to move something in only 2 directions, and that's how to do it. So, okay. That's kind of the basics of how you can start manipulating these objects. There's 2 other related things that I want to call out about geometry, and to do that I'm going to delete the cube. So I'm going to hit Tab to go into object mode, and X, and delete. And then I'm going to hit Shift A and add in a UV sphere. And the default one is fine. It's got way more faces than we need, but it's good for illustrating the next thing that I want to illustrate. And that is edge loops and face loops. So as this mesh is being created or generated or modified in whatever way, there's this thing called edge loops, and you will be using edge loops, adding edge loops, deleting edge loops, scaling edge loops, all that, all the time. It's a very common thing as you're creating objects. If I hit Option and left click, it's going to select an edge loop, and you can see what an edge loop is. And I'll go into wireframe so you can kind of see all, or X-ray so you can see all the way through it. Alternately, you could go into wireframe. You could hit Z and go to wireframe and see it that way. It's kind of an alternate view, or an alternate way to do that. But you can see this is a very literal edge loop. It's just a smooth circle that goes all the way around. And this is a way where you can, if you want to scale, let me go into solid view there. You can scale this out and get a nice even deformation. Oops, keep hitting the wrong button. Okay. When you have 2 edge loops next to each other, and you can select multiple, same way you do everything else. Alt left click, Shift, hold down Shift to select another one, and then it's Alt left click. So Alt left click, Shift Alt left click, and you can select multiple. When you select two next to each other, then what you've done is you've selected a face loop. Okay. If you hit 3 and go into face mode and just hit Alt left click, then you'll select the face and you don't have to select multiple edge loops. So loops are going to be pretty important, and we're going to start playing around with those here in just a second. A sphere has a bunch of face loops and edge loops already there, but what if you want to, maybe you have a cube and you don't have an obvious face loop? Well, now you need to learn how to make them. So I'm going to go back to a default cube and go into edit mode. And I'm going to hit 2 to go into edge mode, edge select. And if we right click on the cube, we can see a bunch of edge context options here. And we have right here, about a quarter of the way down, loop, cut, and slide. Okay. Command R is the shortcut. Click on that, and then as we hover over the cube, we get this yellow edge loop that shows up. And it depends on which edge we hover over. It's going to kind of preview a loop cut, right? Cutting an edge loop. It's a loop cut. It's going to preview a loop cut perpendicular to whatever edge that you have that you're hovering over. It's not final yet. You haven't actually changed the geometry at all, but it's showing you where it will be added if you so choose. Okay. If you right click, it's going to go away. It's just going to cancel. That's a consistency in Blender is when you start to do an operation, if you right click it, it'll just cancel it out. So like if I hit G to move this and then right click, it's just going to cancel out that movement and go back to where it was. Same thing with rotate, scale, and a bunch of other tools. So right click again, and we've got loop, cut, and slide. Again, it's Command R. Control R also works. And Control R is what it is on Windows. And we can choose where we want to put it. Now, the tool is called loop, cut, and slide. So if I choose a direction and left click once, it's going to make that orange, and it's actually adding the geometry at this point. But now we're in the slide part of this. So we can slide it back and forth to specify exactly where we want to put it. Okay, so if we want to put it really close to an edge, we can do that. If we want to put it more towards the center, we can do that. If you want to put it exactly in the center, then you can right click, and it's going to cancel the slide. It's still going to add the edge loop, but it will cancel the slide. So I encourage you to follow along at this point, because that's going to help this make sense. So if I right click now, you'll see it's in the center. Okay, so I'm going to go into front view here, and I'll add another edge loop. So I'm going to hit Control R to add an edge loop, and you can see as I'm hovering over this top edge, it's previewing a vertical loop cut. I'm going to left click, and now it turns orange, so it's added. And if I want to add it in the center, it doesn't matter where the edge is. If it's over here, if I right click, it's going to snap it to the center. Okay, so now I've effectively added an edge right down the center in 2 directions on this cube. Okay. I'll add one more edge loop here. I'm going to slide it, and this time I'm going to left click, and now it's going to stay right where it was. Okay, so now I have an off-center one. Okay, so now if I hit 1 to go to vertex mode, you can see I've got a lot more geometry to work with. So if I wanted to, let's say I want to select these 4 faces, and I can scale them down a little bit. Oops. Scale them down. Left click to confirm that. And now I have a little bit of a taper on the top of this cube. So that's adding one edge loop, but you can also add multiple edge loops at a time. So I'm going to hit Command R, Control R, either one. And when the edge loop is previewing yellow, I can either use the scroll wheel to change to multiple edge loops, or I can just type in a number. So if I want to add in 3 edge loops, I can just hit 3 and hit return, and it's going to add those 3. At this point, I've added the edge loops, but now I can still slide them. So I can slide them up and down, or I can right click to keep them in the center. Either one. One additional thing is once you add an edge loop, if you suddenly decide that it's not actually where you want it, you can still slide it after the fact. So if you right click on it with it selected, if you go down the menu a little bit, you have edge slide right there, and now you're right back into slide mode. Okay. So let's say I select with Alt left click and select this edge loop. Okay, see I got the whole loop selected. I can even go to wireframe so you can see. All right, I can right click and edge slide, and then you see as this slides, it's going to evenly slide. So as it gets closer to the edge, it's going to bend, and what it does is it does a percentage of the edge length. So instead of just staying straight the whole way, it's going to slide over to, like, let's say this is like 95% of the way across the edge. So it's not perfectly even, but it is there. And then, oops, wrong button. Oh, Shift Tab. No, it's not doing anything. Okay. If added some edge loops, and then let me get rid of that. Let's go back here. If you've added some edge loops and then decide that you don't want those edge loops anymore, you hate them and they're stupid, you can select the edge loop and then hit X and delete edge loops, and it's going to get rid of those edge loops and make the kind of intersecting edges whole again. If you just delete the edges, you get weird things that you probably don't want, including leaving edge segments, which you definitely don't want edge segments when there's not separate faces separating them. So if you want to delete an edge loop, undo. If you want to delete an edge loop, make sure that you are deleting the edge loops and not just the edges of the vertices. Okay? Before we do a couple of exercises here, and that is something that I do all the time with edge loops, and that is adding 2 at once. If I want to add 2 edge loops evenly, kind of not evenly spaced, but both kind of equal distances away from their edges, here's what I'll do. So I'm going to add in 2 edge loops. Okay, so Control R, scroll wheel to change it to 2, or just type in 2 and hit return. And then I'm going to, once I'm in slide mode, I'm going to right click to keep them in the center. And then in order to keep the top and the bottom distances even, I'm just going to scale them apart along the Z axis. And it's like sliding them, but it's sliding them both at the same time, so that now I'm maintaining an equal distance both ways. Okay, little kind of a trick that I use all the time for keeping things even and symmetrical. As I was doing that, you notice that I accidentally, or briefly, I was scaling everything. And so now we can, as we're scaling these down, you can see that we're starting to get some other interesting shapes as we go. So hopefully this is starting to kind of trigger some thoughts as to how you could achieve various shapes, and maybe your homework last week, you might be thinking of ways that this would have been rather beneficial, but didn't have the knowledge then, and now you do. It is in the same vein, it's definitely adding edge loops, but in a different way, is the offset edge loop tool. if I right click, and right below loop cut and slide we have offset edge slide. And then we can, whoops, sorry, that's not what I actually wanted to do. Works. I'm going to select this center edge loop, and if I want to add an edge loop on either side, evenly spaced, I can right click on it, and here's offset edge slide. You can see the shortcut is Shift Command R. On Windows that'll probably be Shift Control R. I'm going to select that, and now as I, of course it doesn't do it this time, let me undo. Right click, offset edge loop. There we go. Now I can drag back and forth, and you can see I've got two edge loops that are kind of mirrors of each other, staying evenly spaced. So every once in a while this might come up, and that's how you do that. Okay, let's move on to an exercise. An hourglass using primitives, scaling, and edge loops, and that's it. So to do that, first I'm going to get rid of this cube, and we're going to start with a sphere. So I'm going to hit Shift A, add mesh, UV sphere. Okay. And just to get into the habit, on the bottom left here, where it says add UV sphere, I'm going to maximize that. I'm going to bring the segments down. Just to keep it simple, we're going to do like 12 and 12. And the, actually for rings, let's go 15 for rings. I want an odd number because I want this center section to be vertical. Okay, I'm just going to make this part a little bit easier. So 12 segments, around 15 rings. The default radius is fine, and everything else is fine. So once I have that, I'm going to hit Tab to go into edit mode. And the first thing I want to do is just kind of define the overall shape of this, and then I will go back and add the contours. So I'm going to, I can either go into X-ray mode, or I can just hold down Z, go over to wireframe mode. That works too. I'm going to go to vertex select by hitting 1. And I'm just going to click and drag across the top half of my sphere. And I can orbit around. You can see that I actually missed some, so I do need to have X-ray on. That's good to know. Okay, so toggle X-ray is on. I can go back to my front view by hitting 1 on the number pad. I like to select in these orthographic views because it's just a cleaner selection, and I can be a little bit more precise, especially when I'm selecting symmetrical objects. So 1 on the number pad, left click and drag across just the top half. Again, it's a good idea to orbit around and just make sure that you only have selected what you want. Okay. Once I'm satisfied that I have just that selected, I'm gonna hit 1 on the number pad again. And I just want to move this half up. To move, to grab, right? And then Z to constrain it to the Z axis. And this is where I'm going to define roughly what the size of my hourglass is going to be. And that looks about right. Right now we've made a capsule. We've made a pill of sorts. But that defines the top and the bottom shapes, roughly. And now we just have to figure out how to get that actual hourglass shape. At this point, we know we're going to add edge loops, as preceded by the last 24 minutes of this video. It's probably a pretty safe bet. But now we need to make a decision, and this is kind of both an artistic and a technical decision of how many edge loops do we want to add. It's a good rule of thumb to not use any more geometry than you absolutely need to keep the geometry as simple as possible. It makes adding textures to it easier, it makes render times faster, and it just makes modifying the shapes easier. So we can kind of experiment with this as well. So if I just add, Control or Command R and just add 1 edge loop right in the center, and then scale that down, that is kind of an hourglass shape. Right? I'm going to go back into solid view, and as we orbit around, we're kind of in the hourglass shape. It's not particularly smooth, but it's there. But we can afford to add a little bit more detail. So I'm going to undo that. And I'm going to add, at first, I'm going to add 2. Okay. I want 2. I'm going to keep them evenly spaced. And I want them in the center. So I'm going to, once I'm in slide mode, I'm going to right click on them and just keep them snapped to the center. Okay. And I'm going to do this in front view so that you can kind of see what's about to happen. I have these 2 edge loops, and I want to, again, bring that hourglass shape back into this. Now, if I just hit S to scale, a couple things happen, right? Because I'm just globally scaling, or just scaling everything towards the center of the selection all at once. And we're noticing a couple of things here. Scaling in all directions, not only is it getting skinnier, but the 2 edge loops are getting closer together. Okay, so this is something to keep in mind when you have multiple objects or multiple components selected, is which exact directions that you're scaling in. So just by hitting S and no axis, it's going to, as I scale them apart, they get wider and, further apart vertically. And then the opposite as you scale in. Also, if you go too far, you get this, and this is bad. Don't do this. So if you go past 0 into the negatives, as you can see in the scale up here on the top left, bad. That's bad. Don't do that. Keep it positive. Stay positive. All right. So this does kind of work, but you'll get a little bit more control if you do it in 2 steps. So the first thing is I'm going to just scale in the Z direction, just vertically, to figure out how far apart do I want this. Because this is going to define the skinniest section of the hourglass. And if I was being responsible and listening to my own advice, I would, on the other screen, search for hourglass in Google and find a reference image, which I may or may not have done before, but I'm doing now, I promise. Here's an hourglass. It's a different shape, but it is an hourglass. Here's another hourglass. So you can see there are obviously varieties, and this is why figuring out reference ahead of time is helpful, so you know exactly what shape you're going for. Okay, let's say like this one, or so. So I want a gap that kind of feels like that, and that this vertical scale, so S to scale and Z, whoops, make sure I'm in Blender, S and Z, about that feels right. Again, I don't need to be exact, but I'm setting that dimension first, so that the next thing that I can do is now I just want to focus on the diameter of this part of the hourglass. So I don't want to just hit S and just let it go, because you can see they're getting closer together. This is where choosing what axes you're scaling along is important. So I'm going to hit Shift Z, so it can't scale vertically, and no matter how much I scale, their distance apart is going to stay the same. And then I can scale it down and get the right diameter. Okay? So go something like that. And you can see as I scale it down, this feels like maybe a little bit too much. So I'll scale SZ a little bit and get back closer to what I want. Okay? And then from here, we can add a couple more edge loops. We can just add one edge loop up here, and I'm going to keep it in the center, and one edge loop down here, and keep that in the center. Actually, I lied. I'm going to do 2 and 2. So 2 edge loops here, and 2 edge loops here. Okay. I'm going to go to edge mode, and I just want to select the edge loops, and I'm going to scale those vertically towards each other. And that's going to start giving me a little bit of a, well, no, I like that better. Instead of that, I'm going to scale them out. So instead of scale and just Z, I'm going to go scale and Shift Z, and I'm just going to bring some form back into this hourglass. And now we can see we have a nice curve leading down to it. Okay, and that's as far as we're going to go with this hourglass. But it demonstrates a few different options and uses for edge loops, and then how you can work with multiple edge loops to help define forms. Another thing to be careful of when you're scaling, especially with circular objects, is if I just hit S and X to scale along the x-axis, it looks like everything is staying, relatively smooth and even. But as soon as I orbit my view around, you can see that I've now created an oval. So just make sure you're looking at your objects from multiple angles as you're making these edits, so you know you're making the changes that you want and not any accidental changes. If you need to, you can go to the View menu, Area, Toggle Quad View, and this will show you 4 different views of your object. We have a perspective view in the top right, and then we have a right orthographic, a front orthographic, and a top orthographic. Okay, and you can see as you make a change in one, it is reflected in all angles.